Before I jump into what I want to spend the evening about, I'm going to do a really short commercial. I'm not good at it. I don't like doing it, but I need to do it for one quick reason, and that is I do have the 2 books out there, and Small Church Essentials is with Moody Press, and so you can order that online at any time you want. So if you don't get it tonight, you can get it later. It's cheaper tonight, but you can get that at any time. But the reason I want to mention it is because The Grasshopper Myth is a self-published book. So I don't have a distributor, I don't have a publisher, and shipping it across the border is really expensive. So if later on you want a book, it's going to cost you like $45 to get, because I got to pay like $30 just for the shipping across the border. So I think you might be interested in getting another copy for a friend, or to work through with your staff members, or for other pastors in your town. They're available tonight, and after I'm gone, getting them is going to be very, very difficult. I am working with Moody on a republish and reissue of this, but it'll be a couple years away. We also have this one available in French because the Quebec district of the PAOC translated it for me. So we have a couple French copies there as well. So that's why I wanted to let you know, just so you don't miss it. I don't want you to a week later think, hey, maybe I'd like to check that out. You can get either one of them on Kindle. That's easy to do. But if you want a physical copy, tonight is really the only way to get that. So just so you're aware. Thus endeth the commercial. All right. I want to start tonight talking about district councils. Last night I shared with you about some of my challenges and frustrations and a particularly difficult season that I went through before I came to the realization that it's okay to be a pastor of a healthy small church. And when I was going through that season where our church had gone up for a while and then collapsed in a heap, and I was trying to figure out what is going on and why can't I seem to get the numbers to where all of the church growth books promise me I can get them. During that season, every year faithfully, I did as you did. I went to our district council. And every year at our district council, for me in Southern California, our district superintendent would get up and give a state of the district report, as they're supposed to do. And in that report would be all kinds of things, from great things that happened, some of the challenges we faced, and some of that was numerical, as it ought to be. And every year, a section of that numerical report, which was a section of the broader state of the district report, every year they would give stats that went like this. Over 90% of our churches are under 200, and over 80% are under 100. Every year, they would give that stat, and that stat would not change by more than a percentage point or two every single year. Over 90% of our churches are under 200, and over 80% are under 100. And I remember that season that I was going through that really, really difficult time, and I heard that statement. And every time I'd heard it in years before, that statement was always followed by a sentence, something along the lines of, we have to fix this problem. And so that year, I was just in a foul mood. And they gave the stats again, and I knew what the next sentence was going to be, some version of, we need to fix this problem. And have you ever been in a room and the speaker is speaking and they say something that triggers you to go on a thought over here, and even though they're going on a thought somewhere else, you're on a thought in your own track? It may be happening to some of you right now. Well, that was me. He went on over here with what he was going to say, and I went on a totally different track. And right after he said over 90% of our churches are under 200 and over 80% are 100, my first reaction was this: oh no. For years, that was my first reaction. Actually, before this year, for years, I would hear that every year. And my first reaction for several years was, oh no, oh no. I would sit there every year at district council and hear over 80% of our churches are under 100, over 90% of them are under 200, and I would look at it and go, oh no, I'm part of the problem. It's being stated as a problem after all, and I don't want to be a part of the problem. I want to be a part of the solution. What's going on? Oh no, my church is under 200. For a whole bunch of time it was under 100. I'm a part of the problem. I need to be a part of the solution. Oh no. And then that year, when that sentence came out again, my brain went to a completely different place. From oh no, my second reaction became this: so what? Okay, fine. My church is small. So what? Whole lot of small churches. So what? Just don't care anymore. Now, when you get someone who's hurting so much that they say they don't care anymore, that's when they have really begun to care far too deeply for them to admit to themselves. And I just sat there and I stared at my own district superintendent and looked at him and thought, so what? But I'm a stubborn guy, and so when I ask so what, I want to figure out so what. So I figured out so what. I went home and I did some research, and here's what I discovered. That statement, 90% of churches are under 200, 80% are under 100, which is globally true across countries, across denominations, within just a few percentage points of that. Virtually every denomination in every region of the world has some statistic very, very close to that. What I discovered was this. The fact that 90% of our churches are under 200 and 80% of our churches are under 100 says nothing about the health of that region or that district or that denomination or that movement. It says nothing. Here's why. If a denomination or movement is in revival, a big part of that revival of that denomination is the planting of new churches. And when new churches are planted, they tend to be what size? Small. So when a region or a denomination or a movement is in revival and renewal of God's Spirit and the entire group is growing, a big part of that is that there are actually more small churches being planted, so the percentage of small churches remains high. If it's in decline, then the existing churches typically are getting small, and so the percentage of small churches remains high. Here's the reality of it. Whether a group is in revival or in decline, the percentage of small churches to large churches always stays high. So this stat on its own is important to know, but it has to be linked to other information for us to understand whether or not it's good news or bad news. So if you are in one of the churches that's small, and we hear about how many small churches are in our particular area, you are not part of the problem because that is not necessarily a problem. So I had to leave the so what behind. Now, I had to ask so what, but I had to get past so what. And after the Lord helped to bring some healing into my heart and into my life, I was able to get to my final reaction, which was, okay, now what? All right, I'm pastoring a small church. Now what? What are we going to do about that? What does a healthy small church look like? How can we do great things for the kingdom of God from within our small congregation? And in discovering the now what, let me give you an illustration. The movie Apollo 13 is based on, of course, the real events of Apollo 13, what was supposed to have been the third moon landing. And then partway to the moon, there's damage to their spacecraft, and a discovery mission now turns into a rescue mission, and they don't know if they're going to be able to get the astronauts back to Earth safely again. They have one problem after another, which is chronicled in the movie. And then they get to one point where an engineer rushes into headquarters of Houston and says, okay, we've got another new problem, and here's what it is. The astronauts are about to suffocate because we've run out of air filters, because they were supposed to have been in the other part of the spacecraft to land on the moon. Since they weren't and they just stayed where they were, they've already used up all the air filters where they are. So he says, well, then go to the other part of the spacecraft that was supposed to land on the moon, get the air filters there and bring them over. He said, we've done that. The problem is they're different sizes and shapes. To which Houston responds, tell me this isn't a government project. So they literally have a round filter that they have to fit into a square hole. So the next scene in the movie, there are a couple engineers who take a couple large boxes of material and they dump them on a huge table in front of a bunch of other engineers. And essentially what they tell them is this: everything that's on this table is everything that's on Apollo 13. So using only what's on this table, we have to figure out how to fit a round filter into a square hole, or those astronauts die. Now, why are we limiting ourselves to only what's on the table? Because what's on the table, it's what's on Apollo 13. There's no amount of faith, there's no amount of wishing, there's no amount of planning that is going to put an item on Apollo 13 that is not on this table. You got to use the mess on this table, not one item of which was intended to do the job, but the job has not changed and lives are at stake. Get it done. I do not know a better description of what it's like to pastor a small church than that illustration. Right? Really, Lord, this is the mess you gave me? Yep. The mission hasn't changed and lives are at stake. Get the job done. Right? There's a saying in business, and it's now made its way into church circles, and it's a good saying to the most part, and it's get the right people on the bus. How many of you have heard somebody say, get the right people on the bus, right? What they mean by that is if you're putting a staff together, a team together, make sure you got the right people in the right places, because one wrong person on the team can tear the whole thing down. And it's from a really good book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. It's really, really helpful. The challenge in a small church is this. Get the right people on the bus. These are my people. This is my bus. There's no right people. There's no wrong people. What you call the wrong people, I lovingly call my church members. Right? See, in a large church, in a large congregation, in an IKEA-sized church, as we talked about last night, you can go out and you can hire people. You've got a resource. You've got a budget. You can get the right people on your staff because you can actually go out and hire them. In a small church, this is who I've got. This is my Apollo 13 table mess, but guess what? Our assignment is still the same and lives are at stake. We still have to get the job done. So that's our now what. Okay, our church is small, now what? We still got to get the job done. And here's the amazing thing. Any competent engineer can get the job done with the right resources and the right materials. It takes somebody special to get the job done with an Apollo 13 table mess. And that's one of the reasons I love my fellow small church pastors, because you are doing the same job with far fewer resources and a mix of people that only God himself would have saddled you with. And sometimes you wonder, Lord, why? And then all I got to do is read the Gospels and see the mix of people that Jesus picked and go, oh, okay. I get it now. That's why he did that. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to take that idea and I want us to go to this illustration that you see on the wall behind me. We talked about it a little bit last night. There are ways that big churches operate, and there are ways that small churches operate. And there is some overlap to that. So if you go to a typical church leadership conference, especially some of the larger ones, and you hear most of the speakers, they're going to be speakers out of large contexts, out of big churches, and they're going to be speaking to you from the circle on the left. Why? Because that's their context. That's what they know. But most of us are sitting in the circle on the right, and so there's only a certain amount of things they're going to say that are going to apply in our context. The challenge is, and the challenge that I had for years was, I would go to these conferences and I would just think, well, they're bigger than me, therefore they're ahead of me, therefore they know more than me, therefore what they say I'm going to take home and do. And I would go home, and what I wouldn't realize was that anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 to 90% of what they said is in the part of the circle that doesn't overlap with my circle. And I'd go home and almost everything I tried would fail. It got to the point where my congregation dreaded every time I was going to go to a conference. I'd come back with some new idea. This is the idea that's going to change our church. And they go, oh, what book did he read now? Right? And it wasn't that they were unwilling. They were just tired. And I did that because, first of all, I didn't realize that it's not about scale. It's about context, and their circle is different than mine. And two, if I had known about the different circles, I didn't know what was in their circle that was different from what was in my circle. So what we're going to talk about this evening is what is in that circle on the right. We're going to do some contrast with the circle on the left, not in a good and bad way, but so that we can really make the distinction. And in addition to hopefully some things that you'll be able to take home tonight as practical tools, from this point on, every time you hear a large church pastor speak, you will now have a filter that you can use to say, oh, that might work, that definitely won't, and you will then get more value out of even the big church conference because you'll know how to filter it for your context. That make sense? So we're not against each other. Nobody's doing anything wrong here. We're simply in different contexts, and so we're going to walk through some of that this evening. So what we basically got, these circles describe, is that most big church principles don't translate well into a small church context. There's just simply not a whole bunch of overlap. This, again, is one of the challenges of the small church pastor, and one of the reasons for my admiration of the small church pastors who are doing a good job, because small church pastors really have to master 3 different sets of principles. First set of principles is they got to know what all churches have in common. You got to know you got to have a good ecclesiology and good methodology. Secondly, you have to understand what is distinct about small churches so that you've got your small church context. And then third, you've got this context. Let me show you this next slide. In addition to these 2 circles that overlap, we've got these little circles that I like to call my little Wonder Bread circles. And I want you to notice there are 3 things about these circles that are important. First of all, they're all different sizes. Secondly, they're all different colors or shades. And thirdly, and most importantly, they don't touch. Here's why they don't touch. While the brown part on the right is the part that every small church pastor and every small church has in common, and we have a lot in common, every one of those circles represents the unique part of your congregation that makes it completely different than any other congregation on the face of the earth. And here's the interesting inverse correlation. The smaller your church is, the larger your unique DNA footprint is. Let me say that again. The smaller your church, the larger your unique part is. Okay, and here's why. It's because of something that's called the law of large numbers. I discovered this principle a few years ago, and when I did, it was like a light bulb went off in my head about small churches, okay? The law of large numbers states, the bigger the crowd, the more predictably they behave. This is how every polling company works. Gallup or Pew or Barna go out there, and they'll interview 3,000 Canadians, and then they will tell you, here's how all of Canada feels about the subject. And you'll go, all of Canada? Nobody asked me. Right? But people pay a lot of money for these surveys because they tend to be fairly accurate within 2 or 3 percentage points. They really do a good job at this. Now, how can you do that? How can you say what all 37 million or so Canadians feel when you've only interviewed 3,000, 3,500 of them? Here's why. It's because of the law of large numbers. The larger the group, the more predictably it behaves. So if a survey company goes out and asks the right questions of the right demographic mix of people, and thirdly, here's the key for what we're looking at tonight, and if they ask a minimum sample size, then all they have to do is add zeros, and things don't change very much. So if you interview 3,500 Canadians about a particular subject and you ask the right questions of the right demographics, and you have 3,500 Canadians, you can just add some zeros and say, here's pretty much how Canada feels about this particular issue or this particular politician or whatever. And they're surprisingly accurate. But you have to have 3,500 people. If you drop down and only interview 350 people, you can't just add zeros anymore. Why? You don't have minimum sample size. Large groups behave predictably. This is why if you were pastoring a church of 1,000 and you went to a conference and you were listening to a pastor of a church of 10,000, almost everything that the pastor of a church of 10,000 says, you can take home and do it in your church of 1,000. Why? Because you're above minimum sample size, and so your circles are almost completely overlapping. They're 10 times bigger. Shouldn't they be a whole bunch different? No, not really. Because at 1,000 people, you've got multiple staff, you've got parking issues, you've got multiple venues perhaps, you've got multiple departments, and at 10,000, at 10,000, they've just got 10 times more, right? So 10,000 down to 1,000, it pretty much works either way, it transfers down. But if you drop 1,000 down to 100, all of a sudden, nope, it doesn't transfer anymore. Why? Because you're beneath minimum sample size. Right? I'm just talking boring demographics at this point. Right? And when you're at 100, it changes because you're beneath minimum sample size. And then, if you drop from 100 down to 50, it can change again. And then, you can take 2 churches of 50 of the same denomination, in the same town, on the same street, And you might as well be on 2 different planets. Why? Because this church has 50 different people than this church. In this church of 50, when one family leaves, there goes their entire children's ministries department. Not just because the leaders left, because they took every kid with them. Right? Okay? And in this church of 50, when one person doesn't show up on a Sunday, and it's that one person that we all love, but when they don't show up on a particular Sunday, everybody breathes a little easier because we're not going to have that awkward confrontation in the lobby, and there won't be that message in tongues and interpretation that hasn't been from Jesus in a decade. Can't use that illustration with the Baptists. I like being in my own crowd. And you're all laughing, and right now I'm looking around and I know every one of you has a name and face in mind. And don't pretend you don't. I know you do, because here's the rule. Every church has one. And if your church doesn't have one, some other poor church has 2. I tell you, there are Sundays that I'm convinced that there are 3 churches in our neighborhood without one. I tell you. Right? Now, here's the deal. The big church has that awkward person too. But in the big church, that just means the pastor gets a weird email once a week. In a small church, they can ruin your Sunday. They can split your church. They can drive a pastor away. One person. Because the flip side of the law of large numbers is this. If the bigger the crowd is, the more predictably it behaves. The smaller the crowd, the more impact each person has, for good and for bad. I just described the bad to you. Let me describe the good. If you play a little bit of guitar, and you walk into a mega church with a band that is singing songs from their latest album, you're going to look at the stage and go, I am never getting on that stage, am I? Nope. It wouldn't be good for you, wouldn't be good for them. It's okay. But if you play a little bit of guitar and you walk into a church of 50, you could be the worship leader in a month. In fact, you let it out that you play some guitar, they're going to go, is it in your car now? Hey, buddy, do we have that old guitar? Is it still back in the shed? Can we get it? You want to leave this morning? Would you like, right? Immediately. Why? Because in a smaller church, you can have bigger impact. One of the reasons people choose to go to small churches is because of the impact they can have. And they're not wrong for that. Right? If I play some guitar and I want to use that, I'm going to go to a church where that can be used, where that can be a blessing. And why not? In a small church, if you've got someone who decorates their house beautifully, they can be the person who's in charge of changing out your chapel and your lobby for every new season and decorating it beautifully for everybody who comes by. In a big church, they're not going to do that. In a big church, you got to have a professional graphic designer that matches everything up properly so that there's one voice speaking throughout the entire place, and appropriately so. In a church of this size, it would not be right to pick someone who decorates their house nicely to do their graphic design. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. Not right. But in your church, my church, in a smaller church, hey, that's great. I can use my gifts. So here's this person who's got these gifts, and they're not lesser gifts, they're not limited gifts, they're just gifts that are appropriate for different sizes. That's all. So you've got a lot of folks in your church who can use their gift and they can have a greater impact because of the size of your congregation. This is what I call the why is my church so weird part. Right? Why is your church so weird? Because the smaller the church is, the more impact each person has, for good and for bad. When I first came to my congregation, and again, I love it being in a Pentecostal group, because here's another story I can't tell to the Baptists. First Sunday there was a pause in the worship service, and somebody jumped up and gave a message in tongues, and everybody calmed down and listened to it. Started with an interpretation, got halfway through the interpretation, and went, "Oh, I lost it," and sat down. After the service, I went over, "Jimmy, come here." I went in my office. I said, "What was that?" He said, "Well, it was tongues and interpretation. Don't you know about tongues and interpretation?" I said, "Oh, I know about tongues and interpretation. I'm third generation Assemblies of God. I want to know what that was." He said, "Well, it's tongues and interpretation, but partway through the interpretation, I lost what it was going to be, so I quit." I said, "Okay, here's the deal. I give you one private warning. This is it. The next time you believe you have a tongues and interpretation, before you stand up and begin the tongue, you better know what the interpretation is going to be from beginning to end. And if it does not complete, I will call you out as a false prophet publicly next time." "Oh, you're so mean. You're stifling the Spirit." "No, I'm not. I'm protecting the flock." Now, he wasn't a bad guy. He wasn't a mean guy. But you know what? After I did that, you know, the buzz that went through the church, "He can handle Jimmy. We have a pastor who can handle Jimmy." It turns out that before I came, they regulated their worship service to go through at a constant noise level without any pause ever, because at any pause, Jimmy would jump in. True. I said, "I'm not living under that kind of tyranny. We're going to have highs, we're going to have lows, we're going to have pauses, we're going to have quiet spots, and nobody's going to have to be nervous about somebody doing something crazy because we're quiet for a moment." They had allowed one guy to dominate the whole thing. Smaller the crowd, the more impact each person has. Some for good, some not so good. And so what we need to do as small church pastors is encourage the good and protect the flock against the bad. One of the big differences between those two circles is, if you want to sit and be a passive religious consumer and not get involved in a church, what type of church are you likely to go to? Big church, because you can disappear in a bigger church. That's why healthy big churches understand this, and that's why they're constantly promoting small groups and ministry teams, because they know they have to fight against the pull towards passivity, because in a large crowd, it's easy to be passive. So healthy big churches know this. That's why they push small groups and ministry teams. The issue in the small church is the opposite. The issue in the small church isn't the passive, it's the passive-aggressive, otherwise known as the control freak. Because if you're a control freak, what size of church are you going to show up at? Small one, because you can have more control. And folks, sometimes the control freak in our church is looking at us in the mirror in the morning. Pastors. Some of us are doing that, right? So passive is the problem in the big church, and a healthy big church is constantly aware of that. Control freak is a problem in the small church, and a healthy small church is aware of that, and a healthy, strong pastor will protect the congregation from that happening. That's one of the challenges that we have. The smaller the crowd, the more impact each person has for good or for bad. Now, this is why metrics, for instance, are harder in a small church than in a big church. In a big church, if you've got a church, again, let's say of 1,000 people, and you've got a 20% drop year to year, that's 200 people. You better pay attention to that. But in a small church, 20%? Here's a typical small church. We got a church of 50, we got 50 on Sunday. Next week, we got 25. Church split? No, it's cottage season. It's fishing season. It's flu season. The next week, 100. Revival? No, you're dedicating a baby that morning and the entire extended family showed up. But that's the morning that the worship leader, if you have one, calls you up and goes, I'm sick, I can't come. So you, pastor, are leading and singing a cappella badly, and as you're doing it, you're looking out at the biggest crowd of the year and going, not one of these new people is ever coming back. Next week, 50. So we have these massive percentage swings in small churches, not the same as in big churches. So you've got to relax on the numbers. If we look at numbers in small churches the way they look at numbers in big churches, you'll drive yourself crazy. Now, in a bigger church, the numbers do matter. And here's why, for instance, we fill out an annual report and send it into our district, into our national office. All they care about is numbers? No, because at the district level and at the national level, they're dealing with thousands of people, potentially hundreds of thousands of people at the national level. And when you're dealing with numbers of that size, a 10% shift can change their budget, can change their staffing, can change who goes on the mission field or not. Small percentages matter when you're dealing with big numbers. So send those in, let them hear your voice, but don't live or die by small percentage shifts in your small church. It will drive you crazy. Now let me give you another set of differences between big and small that's really, really important. Big church principles center on process, systems, and programs. And by principles, I don't mean this is what they're about. I mean the things that they talk about in staff meeting about the functioning of the congregation. So if you go to large church conferences, have you noticed recently that it seems to be all about process and systems and programs? I was at one a few years ago, and I was having lunch in the middle of it with a bunch of small church pastors, and one of them said, every conference is about all of the latest processes and all of the latest systems and all the latest methods and the latest curriculum. Have we forgotten about, Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit? I said, no, that's not the case. I said, if you got an IKEA-sized church and your processes and systems and programs break down even a little bit, it's mayhem. You've got to have good processes and systems and programs when you've got a large congregation. You've got to figure that out. And so they pass it on to others. So that's what happens in big churches. In small churches, however, it's different. Small church principles center on relationships, culture, and history. Let me walk you through these three things. First of all, relationships. When you ask people who go to a small church why they go to small churches, the number one answer that comes up is this: the pastor knows my name. There are a bunch of people out there who have the idea that they want to be pastored by their pastor. Freaks and weirdos. But sometimes they're treated like that, aren't they? Oh, how dare you want to be pastored by your pastor? Don't you know they've got busier things to do and trying to grow the numbers, blah, 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 blah. Stop. In a smaller church, we don't have to pastor them. We get to pastor them one-on-one. We get to know their names. And a big part of the reason they show up is because they're known. Now, if God blesses the church in a numerical way, and that's not the only way he blesses us, but if he happens to bless our church in a numerical way and it starts growing numerically where the pastor can't know everybody's name, if at that point they try to jam on the brakes because their needs aren't being met anymore, then we've got a problem. But if somebody simply decides, I want to show up at a small church because I want to be able to call the pastor themselves when I have a question or a problem or I'm in the hospital, there's nothing wrong with people wanting to be pastored by the pastor. Relationships are a big part of the reason we go to small churches. Secondly, culture. Now, when I say culture, I don't mean one church is casual, one church is formal. That's not culture, that's style, that's surface. Culture is beneath the surface. Culture is the unwritten set of rules that governs what we do. Anytime somebody says, yeah, that's the way we do it at our church, that is a statement of culture, whether they realize it or not. And the best teaching on culture is Jesus' parable of the sower. And Jesus tells an agricultural audience that a sower goes out to sow his seed, and he starts scattering the seed, and it lands randomly on 4 different types of soil. Now, at that moment, any farmer is going to stick up their ears and notice it, because the first thing they're going to think of is, that's the worst farmer I ever heard of in my life. No good farmer just randomly scatters seed on and it happens to land on whatever soil. A good farmer tills the soil, gets it ready, and plants the seed specifically exactly where it needs to be. So as soon as he framed the parable that way, what he was telling them was, this is not about farming. This is about something else. So their ears were perked and they were listening. And he says, So the sower goes out to sow the seed. The seed doesn't change, but the soil does. And he describes 4 different types of soil. First type of soil. You're in your church, and you present an idea and go, I think the Lord wants us to do such and such. And the reaction from the church is, we don't do it that way in our church. Jesus described that soil as the seed goes in, it lands on top of the soil, but the soil is hard and it doesn't penetrate, and the birds of the air come and pick it up and take it away. If your church is constantly responding to new ideas with, we don't do it that way, you have a stubborn culture. Stop throwing good seed on hard soil. You're wasting the seed. Before you can implant mission, you have to break the soil. You have to soften people's hearts. You have to break the spirit of stubbornness. We had a stubborn church when we showed up, not because of meanness, but because of pain and hurt. Remember I told you yesterday, for the first few years, what did we do? Worship services and potlucks. We learned how to love God and love each other again. We softened the soil so that it could receive the mission. Second soil, you go to them and say, hey, I've got a great idea. And they go, oh, we love that idea. And then nobody shows up for the planning meeting. That's the second soil. Jesus said it goes in, it grows up really quickly, but then it dies in the heat of the day. Why? Because it's shallow. There's not enough depth in the soil. Some of us are serving a shallow church. And if our church is shallow, what do we need to do? We need to help them go deeper. A shallow church needs a clearer understanding of the mission and the heart of God and good theology and good teaching to understand here's what we're here to do. So if you keep pitching ideas to a church that keeps saying, that's great, go ahead and do that, Pastor, we won't show up for the planning meeting, stop sowing good ideas there, start teaching good theology, good teaching, a better understanding of their role in the kingdom of God, help them go deeper, and then you've got a place to plant the seed. Thirdly, hey, here's a new idea. That's a great idea, Pastor. Let's add that to the 17 other things we're doing this week. That's the busy church culture. Jesus describes it as the seed goes in. It grows up all right, but it grows up among weeds and thorns and thistles, and all the other busyness of life drowns out the good seed. Some of us are serving a busy church culture. We've got so many events. And a lot of us are in a place where we need to start trimming them back. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then you've got the fourth culture, where it's soft and it's deep and it takes the seed and it produces a harvest. So let me just give this to you. This may be the biggest takeaway for some of you in your congregations this week. If you have been trying to sow good seed, good mission, good vision, good ideas into a church, and they're not receiving it, you may not have a mission problem, you may have a culture problem. And there's a saying in business today that actually works in this context. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Doesn't matter how good your strategy is, it doesn't matter how good your mission is. If you're trying to sow it into a bad culture, it will not go. So some of us need to fix the culture before we can start new mission. The best book I know on this is a book by a friend of mine called Dirt Matters by Jim Powell. And if you go to my website, the bottom right there, newsmallchurch.com/BCYD, if you go there, in the notes at this point, there's actually a link where you can go and you can order his book. It's really short. He describes all of this. He helps you understand whether or not you have a culture problem. He helps you understand what your culture problem might be, and he helps you understand how to fix your culture problem. So we hear an awful lot about mission, and understandably so. But before we can get to mission, we've got to fix culture. We've got to help the stubborn culture be less stubborn. We've got to help the shallow culture go deep. We've got to help the busy culture be simple. And there are other bad cultures as well that we might have. But some of us have a culture problem. So relationships, culture, and thirdly, history. Small towns have long memories. And so do small churches. So particularly if you are new at the church, and in some small towns, 12 years in the church may still be the new pastor in town. I get it, right? That's the way it is in some places. But especially if you are new, you need to spend some time understanding the history of that church so that you can move it into a preferred future. What we too often do is we walk in, we think we've got the answers, and we try to pull them into a preferred future. And they resist, and we don't understand why. And here's one illustration of what the Lord used to help me. Several years ago, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the congregation that I serve. We had all kinds of stuff out on a table with old newspaper clippings and pictures and so on. And as I was looking at it all, I ran across an article with the title, "The Church Can Work with Delinquents." This is the actual article. Now, if you're under 40, delinquents doesn't mean they're late on paying their bills. Back in the day, when kids were running around the street and making a mess of things, we called them juvenile delinquents. Today, we call them at-risk youth or some other better term, right? Much better term than juvenile delinquents, although juvenile delinquents really is colorful, isn't it? And this article was written by, you can actually see it up there if you're close enough, and if you're sitting in the back, that's what you get for sitting in the back with those good seats up front. You can't read the screen right now, so there. I know, you get mad at your congregation, so. All right. See, I wait to do this till the end. This is not the first thing I say. I'm going to get meaner in the next 20 minutes, just so you know, because I'm getting on a plane tomorrow. I'm going back home. Just kidding. As it says, as an institutional caseworker and probation officer, I searched for many months for a church really concerned about the needs of juvenile delinquents. Until recently, I could find none. This is 1967, I believe it is. We think youth problems are new. 60s. Kids are running crazy in the street. Juvenile probation officer is trying to find a church that will help them, and he couldn't find any. And then he says, until I found this church, and he starts talking about our newly planted church. He has an interview with our founding pastor, and our founding pastor talks about how excited they are to reach kids in a new way with the old gospel, with new methods and new music. And we're going to build a youth center and a kids center, and we're going to do all this kinds of stuff. And as I'm reading it, I'm looking out 100 feet to my right, and just outside the door of our church, in our parking lot, we run the only skateboard park in our community. Why? Because 15 years ago, when we resurfaced our parking lot, kids showed up on skateboards, and we realized we can either put up no skateboarding signs or we can put up ramps. And we decided the churches on defense put up signs, and churches on offense put up ramps. And more kids have come to Christ, and more of their families have come to Christ through those skateboard parks than any other thing we've done. Because they were on our property already, we said, come on in. And so I took that picture, because anytime anybody in the church dares to come to me and go, I can't believe you have skateboard parks in your parking lot, the founders of the church would be appalled. Oh, really? Here's what the founders of the church said. The church can work with delinquents. Now, not every skateboarder is a delinquent. I get it. But let's be honest, it's a higher percentage. I know, we work with them. So what do we do out of this? Here's the principle that comes out of that. Don't do what our founders did. Think like our founders thought. Too often we think we're honoring the past by singing exactly their songs in exactly their building with exactly their color carpet. And if you read your founding documents, you will not find, we are establishing a church so that we can sing songs only out of this hymn book until Jesus comes. You will not find that in your founding documents. You will find visionary statements by visionary people, because visionary people start churches. So if your history feels like an anchor dragging your church down, don't lean away from it, lean into it. Find the way your founders thought and bring it forward into today. Honor them by honoring their spirit, not by singing exactly their songs. We've got to think differently about it. Now, let me tell you a couple short stories. I'm going to give you a couple quick principles, and then a closing story. So how do we begin to discover what our church does well? There's an old story about a guy who's wandering around a farm, and he comes to the side of a barn where an archer has been shooting arrows against the side of a barn, and as he looks at the side of the barn, there are 5 arrows, and they're sitting dead center of 5 painted targets. He thinks, wow, that guy's good. Without saying anything, the archer goes and pulls the arrows. He goes around the other side of the barn, and on that side of the barn, there's nothing. There's just a barn door. He aims for the barn door 5 times and misses it 5 times extremely. And the guy thinks, well, that's weird. He hit all those other 5 targets dead center, and he literally can't hit the broadside of a barn door. But the archer's not upset. The archer goes over, picks up a paintbrush, and paints a target around where each arrow hit. This, to me, is a great picture of how we as small churches need to figure out how we do what we do well. Here's the deal. If instead of shooting 5 arrows, he'd shot 100 arrows, what he would have discovered is this. Arrows tend to clump. Because of the stance of the archer, because of the wind, because of all kinds of other things, if you shoot 100 arrows, 50 of them may still hit randomly, but 25 are going to gather in this kind of spot, and 25 are going to clump in this spot. And if you are hitting a couple spots a lot by mistake, draw a big target over those spots and aim there on purpose. If you're hitting them a lot by mistake, you'll hit them even more on purpose. So if you're in a small church trying to figure out what you do well, after you fix culture, the next thing you do is this. Start shooting arrows. What does that mean in my context? I don't know. Do the Jesus stuff. Do what Jesus tells every church to do, but now pay attention to what works. Pay attention to what works, and what you'll discover is you do something well. In our church, we discovered what we do well. A few years ago, we discovered, wow, we keep losing our best people. We train up these young people, and the next thing you know, some other church hires them, and they're so unholy, they want food on their back, and they want food on their table and clothes on their back, so they go and they take the paying job and leave us. And we discovered, hey, we train people up and send them out really well. So I went to our leaders and I said, I think this is a part of our mission. Are you okay with investing in people, and as soon as they get really good, some other church is going to pay them, and we're going to lose them, and we're going to have to train somebody else up? And they said, it sounds like kingdom growth to us, we're in. We do that on purpose now because we found ourselves doing it by mistake, because we were paying attention to what was working. So in your church, if you're not sure what works, keep doing the Jesus stuff, change it up. If something doesn't work, stop doing it. If something works, pay attention. And the next thing works, pay attention. And after you've got a handful of things that work, look at them and go, is there a common theme here? Is there something about these things that work that make them work in our context, and figure out what it is? A wonderful illustration of this a few years ago. Actually, I'll get to it at the next one. So discover what your church does well, and then do it on purpose. And then do what I call front-loading the value. Feature what you do well. Too many of our churches do something well, but nobody knows about it. If your church works well with kids, there should be balloons hanging on your church sign every single Sunday morning. Whatever you do well should be featured. There's a wonderful little church in a town called Ione, California, I-O-N-E. Tiny little town up in the mountains, right next to a men's state prison. There are more men in the prison than there are people in the town. They call the people in the prison our friends in the gated community. I love that. And what they've discovered is because there are men in the prison, the women who are either married to or girlfriends of those guys, they move to Ione to be close to their husband or boyfriend. They bring their kids along to be close to dad, and you've got kids running amok through the streets. And so this little church felt a burden for these kids and started ministering to these kids, started connecting with Rural Compassion, which is a part of Convoy of Hope. And every year, 3 or 4 times a year, Convoy of Hope brings in backpacks and shoes and materials for these kids. They have become known as the church that cares for kids. If you go to Ione, California today and you ask, where is Kingsview Assembly of God? Almost nobody will know the answer to that question. If you ask, where's the church that cares for kids? They will tell you exactly the corner it's on. Because they discovered that's what we do well, so let's do it on purpose. So if I'm not a kid, I can't go to the church? No. Kids need, stand-in parents and grandparents. But if you're at that church, you're going to be about kids because that's all they do. But they are known in that town as the church that cares for kids. They found it out by mistake, and now they're doing it on purpose, and now they front-load the value. Everybody knows that's what they do. So if we're going to do that, and especially if we're going to simplify, I know when I got to the complicated thing, I can see, because it's that way in a lot of our churches, that we've got a lot of programs going, and how do I simplify it? How do I take ministries that people love and maybe trim them back? And here's something that I want to describe to you. If you live in a really, really big city, let's say like New York, Manhattan, you're going to pay a whole bunch of money for very little space. And because of that, you're going to have a very tiny closet. But if you're living in, say, New York City, every time you step on the street, you're judged by what you wear, so you got to wear the latest stuff, but you've only got a 3-foot wide closet. So what do? They have something they call the closet rule. And the closet rule is this: you don't put in a new piece of clothing until you've taken out an old piece of clothing. Our churches need to follow the closet rule. Don't add a new ministry until you've taken out an old one. And some of us need a 2-for-1 sale. I'm not kidding. Not kidding. More of our churches would do well by doing few things better than trying to do too many things not really all that well at all. And the smaller the church is, the more this applies. But what we've done is we've seen the big church with this department, and every one of them comes along and says, small groups is the answer for your church. Men's ministries is the answer for your church. Kids ministries is the answer for your church. Hiring an evangelism pastor is the answer for your church. And it may have been the answer for their church, but it ain't the answer for 99% of our churches. Because the Lord has something different in mind for us. We can't add all those things. We need to strip it back and do a few things well. So how do you decide what you're going to keep and what you're going to lose? Ask yourself these 2 simple questions. What does your church do well that you'd like to do more of? And what does your church do poorly that you would like to do less of? See, I'm not telling you to become like another church. I'm telling you to figure out the DNA of your church and lean into it. What do we do well that we want to do more of? What do we do poorly that we'd like to do less of? Now, I'm not pretending that that's going to be easy. Not at all. But if we don't start by asking those questions, we'll never figure it out. We're not going to add something because it's the cool new thing, because the cool new thing may not work in our church. We're not going to drop something because, well, it's an old method that people did years ago, and if it's still working in your church, keep doing it. Keep what works, dump what doesn't. And every few years, you're going to have to ask those questions again because what works changes as time goes on. What used to work in your congregation may not work anymore. And as time goes on, the pace of change is going to increase, not decrease. We've got to constantly be asking those questions. A quick example of a church that asked that question was this. It's a little town in Indiana called Kurtz, Indiana. If you Google it, the first thing it will say is an unincorporated township, which means it's not really a town. Unincorporated. There's a wide spot in the road. There's one town in that wide spot in the road. It's a Nazarene church. If you put a pin in the Nazarene church and take out a 20-mile yard marker and do it around the church, there are fewer than 3,000 people in the general region called Kurtz, Indiana. And I was there not long ago, and the church looked like it was really thriving. So I said, I want to talk to the pastor. And I talked to the pastor, and he said, you know that thing you just talked about trimming ministries down, finding the one thing you do and do it well? Yeah. He said, that's what we did. I said, what was it? I want to know. He says, you're not going to believe it. I go, try me. He says, okay. So I've been here 6 years. At about year 4, all we had done is bury people. One funeral after another. And he says, a couple years ago, I'm sitting at yet another funeral reception looking around and going, man, this is about the only thing we do well is throw funeral receptions. And then I went, oh, we do this well. He said, I got in my car, I drove to the funeral home. I found the funeral director, and I said, here's the deal. Every time anybody dies in Kurtz, Indiana, you tell them that they don't have to worry about their funeral reception. Kurtz Nazarene Church will show up anywhere, at any time, for any amount of people. We will bring the food, we will set it up, we will serve them, we will clean up afterwards and get out of their way so that a grieving family has one less thing to worry about on the day that they bury their loved one. And since then, we have given a funeral reception for every single funeral in Kurtz, Indiana, and we have touched every single person in this community. As he said it, we were standing in his pastor's office, which was right behind the back of the sanctuary, and you could see through 2 windows into the sanctuary. He said, on Monday, I am emptying out my office. We're turning it into the nursery because for the first time in almost 20 years, we have babies in our church. Church growth through funeral receptions. That's the title of my next book. I am not telling you to go home and talk to the funeral director. I am not telling you to go home and put up skateboard ramps. I'm telling you to go home and see what you do well. And if you don't do anything well, start doing stuff until you figure out what you do well. And even if it's something as crazy as throwing funeral receptions, if you do it for the glory of God, you will change your community. There's something unique that you can do extraordinarily well. Well, now I want to jump into the last couple minutes we have together, because I did promise during our little Q&A this afternoon we're going to talk a little bit about changing generations. New generations will not build the kind of churches that their parents built. Everybody's concerned about new generations, and this is the truth, and let me give you some understanding of why. Especially in the PAOC and in the Assemblies of God, we were birthed just about 100 years ago, right? 100th anniversary. We're celebrating a lot of those in these few years now. So we came of age during a season in which Canada and the US came of age, and we were building. First of all, we came of age during World War I and World War II, when people literally went out and saved the world twice using top-down military-type structures. Then they came home and built the infrastructure of our nations with interstate highways and plumbing and electricity in the post-war era. And most of our church buildings were built during that season where our nations were building infrastructure. So during that season, we built in the same kind of way. In that era of my parents' and grandparents' era, security and permanence meant that you bought a piece of land, that you put a permanent building on it, that you bolted everything down to the floor, that you put a denomination on the sign, that you paid your pastor full time. That meant permanence and security. That has changed. Here's the difference between the generations. Previous generations had relationships and built structures. This generation has structures and they need relationships. Because while we were building structures, we were also giving them the first divorce and separation culture in our history. We've given them so much confusion about their identity that one of the big questions that teenagers are asking today is, what gender am I? That's the active conversation that's going on among teenagers today. They think it's something they can choose. That's how confused they are, and we handed that to them. Because while we're building the structures, we're ignoring the relationships. This is why our songs have changed. Now, I don't have to push on this as much as I do in others, because you had great receptivity to new songs done in a new way. Great. But for some of us who are still trying to figure out why have the songs changed so much, here's why. In my parents' and grandparents' era, the songs reflected the kind of churches we were building. We were building churches that said structure and permanence and stability, and so we sang songs of structure and permanence and stability. Today they sing songs of relationships because they've got the stuff and they've lost their relationships. In my parents' era, you could not get money out of their pockets faster than to launch a Capitol building campaign. My kids' era, you want to launch a Capitol building campaign, they're going to look around and go, why should I give you my hard-earned money to build a building? There's tons of buildings. Find one that exists and go there. But they will give to relationships. They will give to people and causes they care about. They're not uncommitted, they're differently committed. Again, this is why the songs have changed. Remember a couple years ago, maybe 2.5, 3 years ago, sitting in the service on a front row on a Sunday morning, and they started a new song that I'd never heard before. And it's one that we've all heard now, Good, Good Father, right? A real popular song the last few years. And I'm sitting there, haven't heard it before, first time. First line comes up. I've heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like. And I look at the screen and go, I have no idea what that means. And then the next line, but I've heard the tender whispers of love in the dead of night. Now I'm sitting on the front row. And the front row is like 3 feet from the stage. So I can't let the worship team see the pastor's eyes visibly roll into the back of my head. So I just act like I'm in prayer. Tender whispers of love in the dead of night. The only time I want to hear those words in church on a Sunday morning is if I'm preaching a series on the Song of Solomon. And then they get to the chorus. You're a good, good father. That's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. And I look around as people who I know and love are breaking in their seats. I look immediately to my right, second row. And there's a mother and her 3 kids. And I've had to physically stand between them and their abusive father on 2 separate occasions to physically protect them. And they're in tears, with their arms raised to the sky, singing, "You're a good, good father. That's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. Loved by God is my new identity." And at that point, I realized I got to get over my issues with the new songs. Every generation sings the songs they need to sing. My grandfather wasn't going to sing Tender Whispers of Love in the Dead of Night. My grandfather was singing A Mighty Fortress is Our God. A bulwark never failing. I don't even know what a bulwark is, but if it's never failing, I'm in. Because those are the songs they needed to sing then. Songs of stability and structure and strength. Because they were coming out of an agricultural society and 2 world wars and all kinds of mayhem, and everybody had PTSD and didn't know it. Am I lying? And today, we need to know our identity. We need to be assured that we're loved by our good, good Father. So, if you don't like the new songs, tough. They're not for you. If you're a mature Christian, quit whining that they're not singing songs your way. If you're a mature Christian, you can worship Jesus no matter what the musical style is. That's what mature means. We sing to help the weak get strong, not to help the ones who should be strong get comfortable. I told you, I'm saving the mean stuff till the end. And I know I've gone a little over, but let me conclude with one short story as the band comes up. I heard a story a couple years ago about a guy named Stephen Ambrose. He's most famous for writing the book Band of Brothers. He's written a lot about World War II. You can go ahead and hit the next slide for this. And he wrote a book called D-Day, really thick book. And a friend gave it to me and said, I want you to read this chapter. And here's what's said in this chapter. In the late 60s, before Eisenhower died, Stephen Ambrose had a chance to interview Dwight Eisenhower, the Allied commander on D-Day, about D-Day. And after he'd finished the interview with Eisenhower, Eisenhower said, I hear you're from New Orleans. Have you had a chance to interview Andrew Jackson Higgins? He said, no, Higgins just passed away. I never got to interview him. And Dwight Eisenhower said, that's too bad. Andrew Jackson Higgins won World War II for us. So Ambrose thought, I got to find out more about this guy. Here's the story of Andrew Jackson Higgins. Andrew Jackson Higgins was a boat builder in New Orleans. As the war was coming along, he had a design for a small boat that he thought the Navy could use. He brought it to the Department of Navy several times, and each time they turned him away and said, we can't use small boats. We need battleships, we need destroyers, we need big ships to go across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, across the English Channel. We can't use your tiny boat. Quit bugging us. They get closer to D-Day and they start realizing that the battleships and destroyers are only going to be able to get the troops to about a mile off the sand. And in order to get from those ships across that mile onto the beach, they're going to need a whole bunch of small boats. But it was getting close to D-Day, and D-Day had a tight window, and they didn't know what to do, so they did the unprecedented thing of putting out a notice to all the boat builders in North America and asking, does anybody have a design for a small boat that we can get built? And Andrew Jackson Higgins goes, ahem. And he shows them their plan, and they go, it's perfect. And he goes, I know. And if you've ever seen a World War II movie like Saving Private Ryan about D-Day, you know what that boat looks like. 20 or 30 troops in a boat with a flat bottom, flat high sides, flat front. The boat goes in, it hits the sand, the front drops down, and a bunch of boys run into hell on earth and save the world. You cannot oversell what they did that day. I remember as a kid in Toronto hearing about D-Day, and they told us that Canadians had a much higher proportionate number on D-Day than most other nations, that we had something like 10% of the troops that landed at Normandy. I Googled before tonight just to be sure that they hadn't mistaught me in Toronto, and they were right. 14,000 of the 150,000 were Canadian. Massively high percentage for the population of the nation. And the Allied troops from all these countries went in and saved the day. Now, I wonder what it would have been like to be a commander of a Higgins boat that day. And you're on the Higgins boat, and maybe you look back at a battleship and go, man, why can't I be the captain of a battleship? I'd be good at that. I know I would. I'd be better than that guy. Instead, I'm stuck here in this Higgins boat, and everybody's shooting at us. But you see, the commander of the Higgins boat could do something that day that the captain of the battleship couldn't. Because before everybody got on that boat together that day, he went to all of the troops under his command, and he asked them for their letters to home. And then he wrote his own letter to home, and he put it in the strong box by his bunk. And if he survived the day, he went back and got those letters and pulled them out. He gave them back to the survivors, usually only about half. And to those other letters that he had to send home, he could do something that the captain of the battleship couldn't do. He could add a personal note. I knew your husband, your brother, your son, your father. We fought together. He died a hero. I will never forget his stupid laugh. I feel like I know you because he showed us your picture every chance he could get. He loved you so deeply. And I will never understand your loss, but I miss him too. As small church pastors, we get to do that. We're with our people in the thick of battle. We feel what they feel. We smell like they smell. We hurt when they hurt. We rejoice when they rejoice. Now, we can't do it on our own. Thankfully, as they're going in, the big battleships got them there. And over their head is paratroopers, like parachurch organizations and denominations, dropping in resources when they need them. On D-Day, if you had taken any element out, it would not have succeeded. We needed big, we needed small, we needed everybody, and that has not changed. Today, our mission is still to save the world through the gospel of Jesus, and it cannot be done without the big churches, it cannot be done without the small churches, it cannot be done without the organizations that come alongside us, like our movement and our denominations, and give us resources when we need them the most. We need everybody in on this. And as a small church pastor, I just want to say to my fellow Higgins boat commanders, thank you for what you do. Don't ever let anybody tell you that what you do doesn't matter, including yourself, because you and what you do is essential.